Welcome to the Warfront Stories World War II channel. Subscribe to our channel because every day we publish stories about the valor of American soldiers based on real events. Support us. Like our videos if you like what we do for you. The granite quarry at Mauthausen sits in stark contrast to the pastoral beauty of the Upper Austrian countryside. Rolling hills stretch in every direction. The Danube River winds through the valley below, and in the spring of 1945, the landscape was beginning to bloom with new life. It was a place where one could easily forget the horrors of war, unless you were among the thousands imprisoned behind the stone walls of Konzentrationslager Mauthausen. On this morning, May 5, 1945, the skies over Upper Austria are clear, the air crisp. Locals in the nearby market town of Mauthausen go about their business as they have since August 1938. When the first prisoners arrived to construct a camp that would become one of the most brutal in the Nazi regime's vast network of terror. The 186 steps of the Todesstiege, the stairs of death, wind up from the base of the Wienergraben quarry to the main camp. For nearly 7 years, prisoners have carried granite blocks weighing up to 50 kilograms on their backs up these uneven, crude stairs cut into the rock face. Those who stumbled often fell to their deaths, or crushed those below them. Those who survived the climb might be forced to jump from the quarry edge in what SS guards mockingly called parachute jumps, a certain death on the rocks below. But on this day, in May 1945, something is different. The camp sits in an uneasy quiet. 2 days earlier, the last SS guards fled, knowing the American forces were closing in. The war is nearly over. Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30 in his Berlin bunker. German forces are surrendering across Europe. For the prisoners who have somehow survived the brutality of Mauthausen, those who have endured starvation, disease, torture, and witnessed countless murders, liberation seems tantalizingly close. Yet death still stalks the camp. Over 3,000 prisoners were murdered in the gas chamber after a selection on April 20, 1945. The last mass gassing took place just a week ago on April 28, claiming 33 Upper Austrian political opponents. Bodies lie unburied. Disease runs rampant. For the remaining prisoners, emaciated, exhausted, traumatized, survival is still not guaranteed. And on the roads leading to the camp, soldiers of the 41st Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 11th Armored Division, part of General Patton's 3rd U.S. Army, are about to encounter one of the most horrific sights of the European war. What they will witness in the next hours will haunt them for the rest of their lives. This is the documented story of the liberation of Mauthausen concentration camp, a testament to the darkest depths of human cruelty and the remarkable resilience of those who survived. Staff Sergeant Albert J. Koziek of the 1st Platoon, Troop D, 41st Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, mechanized, had been awakened early on the morning of May 5, 1945. His unit, part of the 11th Armored Division, nicknamed the Thunderbolt Division, had been advancing rapidly through Austria in the final push against Nazi Germany. Perhaps May 5, 1945 was just another day to you, Koziek would later write. We thought it would be for us too, but before the sun set that day, we had participated in experiences that really taxed our imagination. Their mission that morning was straightforward. Check the bridges at St. Georgen for intactness, as they were on the route to be used by the main body of Combat Command B. This was part of the larger advance toward Linz, a city Hitler had grand plans for, which lay some 20 kilometers away. The squadron moved through the mountainous Mühlviertel region, deliberately avoiding the major roads in the Danube Valley where German troops might still put up resistance. The war was nearly over. Berlin had fallen to Soviet forces, but scattered Wehrmacht and SS units were still fighting. As Koziek's platoon navigated the winding roads through the Austrian countryside, they remained vigilant. Through their field glasses, they spotted a motorcycle and a white touring car with a red cross on the hood approaching. "We laid all our guns on them, because no matter how innocent-looking the Germans might appear, you could not trust them," Koziek recalled. From the car emerged two SS captains, the driver, and a man in civilian clothes who identified himself as an affiliate of the International Red Cross. Fortunately, one of Koziek's gunners, Rosenthal from Chicago, spoke German and could translate. What they learned was astonishing. Beyond the bridge they were supposed to check was a large concentration camp, actually several camps, KZ Gusen I, KZ Gusen II, and KZ Mauthausen. The Red Cross man was trying to contact an American general to surrender this camp and 400 SS guards who, he claimed, would give up peacefully. Koziek made a quick decision. He told the Red Cross representative that he was the direct representative of the commanding general of the 11th Armored Division. It was a bluff, but one that might save lives if it prevented resistance. The situation was precarious. There was no guarantee that the roads to Mauthausen were undefended, despite the assurances. Koziek issued a stern warning to the occupants of the white car leading their column. Even so much as the breaking of a twig would spell their doom. With this understanding, they continued toward St. Gorgon. When they reached the town's outskirts, they found the bridge over the Gusen River intact. To their surprise, German soldiers were visible all over the place, but they appeared to be former Luftwaffe guards who preferred becoming American prisoners of war to continuing the fight. The leading SS officers, they would later learn, had fled Mauthausen and Gusen around April 28th. In the distance, about 2 kilometers east of St. Gorgon, they could see what they believed was their objective, Mauthausen Camp. None of the men in Koziek's platoon knew what horrors awaited them. As Sergeant Harry Saunders, a 23-year-old radio operator from Chicago, approached Mauthausen in his armored vehicle, something caught his eye. A massive banner hung over the entrance gate, crude letters painted on what appeared to be bedsheets. "The Spanish anti-fascists greet the liberating forces." The message was written in English, Spanish, and Russian. A multilingual welcome from prisoners who had organized themselves in the days after the SS guards fled on May 3rd. What Saunders and his fellow soldiers saw next would be seared into their memories forever. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, or in rags, stumbling toward them. Some wept, others cheered weakly. Many simply stared in disbelief. The live skeletons, the people that were in the camp, it was indescribable. It was such a shock. Saunders would later recall in a 2002 interview for the Mauthausen Memorial's Oral History collection. The 41st Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had been the first American unit to arrive at the camp complex. Although they had heard reports of Nazi concentration camps being discovered by Allied forces elsewhere, nothing had prepared them for the reality before them. Frank Hartzell, a technical sergeant with the 11th Armored Division, was just 20 years old when he helped liberate Mauthausen. "What I saw and experienced appalled me," he would say decades later, the outrage still evident in his voice 80 years after the event. As they entered the camp, the Americans were greeted by members of an international committee formed by the prisoners in the last days of April. This committee had been administering the camp since the SS abandoned it to the custody of a guard unit of 50 Viennese firefighters who had remained on the perimeter. The committee members, political prisoners from various countries who had somehow maintained their will to resist, explained the situation. The camp held approximately 40,000 prisoners, many critically ill. Hundreds had died in just the past few days, their bodies unburied. Typhus and dysentery were rampant. Food was nearly non-existent. Among the first Americans to speak with the prisoners was Lieutenant Jack Taylor, but he wasn't a liberator. He was among the liberated. Taylor, an officer in the U.S. Navy who had joined the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, had been captured by the Gestapo in late November 1944 while on a mission in Austria. After enduring months in the camp system, he had been at Mauthausen since January. He was to go to the gas chamber on May 6th, which was the next day, Kosick noted in his account. Taylor told the American soldiers that in the final days, approximately 1,100 people a day were being killed in Mauthausen. As the Americans moved further into the camp, the full scale of the horror began to reveal itself. Bodies were stacked like cordwood, as Major Franklin Lee Clark would later describe, to the point that bulldozers would be needed to create mass graves. For the soldiers of the 11th Armored Division, May 5, 1945, marked not just a military objective achieved, but a confrontation with evil that defied comprehension. Colonel Richard R. Seibel was appointed to take command of Mauthausen after its liberation. What he found was a scene of utter devastation. The main camp, built on a hill overlooking the town, consisted of multiple sections. Barrack sections 1 through 3, an infirmary camp, a Russenlager, camp for Soviet prisoners of war, a tent camp, a camp prison, and the infamous roll call ground. As the Americans moved through the stone buildings, they documented everything they saw. Their cameras captured evidence of crimes that would later be used in war trials against the perpetrators. The barracks, designed to hold around 300 prisoners each, had been crammed with up to 2,000 people in the final months. With no room to lie down, many had died standing up, held upright by the press of bodies around them. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, disease, and death that clung to everything. In the infirmary, the Americans found patients lying on bare wooden bunks, without medication, without care. Many too weak to even acknowledge their liberators. Others reached out skeletal hands, whispering, "Amerikanisch?" in disbelief that salvation had finally arrived. The camp had been deliberately placed on a granite hill where weather conditions were particularly harsh. Strong winds swept across the exposed area, adding to the prisoners' suffering in winter. The stone buildings, the watchtowers, the electrified fences, all had been constructed by the prisoners themselves after the first 300 arrived from Dachau on August 8, 1938. Mauthausen was classified as a Category 3 camp by the Reich Main Security Office, meaning it was designated for prisoners deemed incorrigible and whose return was not desired. For many, their prisoner file had the notation RU, Rückkehr unerwünscht, return undesirable. This was, in effect, a death sentence. The camp's records, which prisoners had managed to save from destruction by the fleeing SS, revealed that more than 190,000 people had been imprisoned at Mauthausen and its subcamps between 1938 and 1945. At least 90,000 had been murdered. Some estimates placed the death toll far higher, possibly up to 320,000. The dead included men, women, and children from 72 different countries. As Colonel Seibel organized the American response, he faced immense challenges. He brought in 2 field hospitals to treat the survivors, but medical supplies were limited, and many prisoners were beyond saving. Those who could be moved were transported to hospitals in nearby towns, but many were too fragile to be relocated. For the Liberators, the shock of what they were witnessing was compounded by the bizarre juxtaposition of the camp's setting. From the main camp, there were spectacular views of the Upper Austrian countryside. Rolling hills, the confluence of the Danube and Enns rivers, the picturesque town below. It seemed inconceivable that such beauty could coexist with such horror. As Major Clark put it, how could such a place of torment exist in such a beautiful locale? Yet it does. Of all the sites at Mauthausen, none epitomized the camp's brutality more than the Wiener Graben quarry. Here, prisoners had been worked to death extracting granite for Hitler's and Speer's grandiose architectural plans for German cities, particularly Linz. When American soldiers descended into the quarry on May 5th and 6th, they were confronted with a place of systematic murder disguised as labor. The infamous Stairs of Death, 186 steep, irregular steps cut into the rock face with picks and held in place by logs, connected the quarry floor to the camp above, covering a vertical rise of 31 meters. Survivor Christian Bernadac would later describe in his book, The 186 Steps, how the stairs were simply cut with a pick into the clay and rock, held in place by logs unequal in height and tread, and therefore extremely difficult, not only for climbing, but also for the descent. Prisoners had been forced to carry granite blocks weighing up to 50 kilograms on their backs up these treacherous stairs. Wearing only wooden-soled sandals, exhausted and malnourished, many collapsed under the weight. Those who fell often created a deadly domino effect, taking others down with them. The SS guards had made a sport of the prisoners' suffering. They organized races up the stairs with the heavy stones, betting on who would reach the top first. Those who survived the climb might then be forced to jump from the parachutist's wall at the top, a sheer drop that meant certain death. The quarry had been the site of the camp's penal company, the most dreaded assignment in Mauthausen. Assignment to the quarry was effectively a death sentence, with prisoners rarely surviving more than a few weeks of the brutal 12-hour shifts with not a second's rest. As the Americans documented the quarry, they were told by survivors that the SS had a term for their approach to prisoner labor: Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through work. For all prisoners, life in Mauthausen meant Rückkehr unerwünscht, return not desired. When Lieutenant Taylor was interviewed by reporters after his liberation, he described how the prisoners had been literally worked to death. Official death certificates prepared by SS doctors routinely concealed the true causes, using euphemisms to hide the reality of the camp. The Americans also learned that the quarry operation had been run by DEST, Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke GmbH, a company led by SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl, head of the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office. DEST had rented the quarries from the city of Vienna in 1938 and established the camp specifically to provide slave labor. The money to fund the construction of Mauthausen had come from various sources, including commercial loans from Dresdner Bank and Prague-based Böhmische Escompte-Bank, as well as funds stolen from the inmates of concentration camps, what the Nazis cynically called Reinhardt's Fund. As they stood at the base of the stairs of death, the American soldiers tried to comprehend how anyone could have survived this place. Yet somehow, among the liberated were those who had endured years of this torment, a testament to human resilience in the face of systematic cruelty. Among the 40,000 prisoners found alive at Mauthausen and its subcamps when the Americans arrived were people from all across Europe. The largest national group consisted of Poles, but there were also significant numbers of Soviet citizens, Spaniards, French, Yugoslavs, Italians, Czechs, Hungarians, Dutch, and Germans, along with smaller groups from virtually every European country. The Spanish prisoners, Republicans who had fought against Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War and later against Hitler in World War II, were among the most organized groups in the camp. Their banner welcoming the Americans was a powerful symbol of resistance. Of the roughly 7,200 Spaniards imprisoned at Mauthausen, only about 2,000 had survived. The Nazis had murdered approximately 60% of them. Stanislav Zalewski, a former prisoner of Gusen who was still alive in 2020 for the 75th anniversary of liberation, recalled the moment. Americans entered Gusen II on 5 May 1945 at around 5 p.m. As a matter of fact, several American soldiers came running, and one of them shouted in Polish, "You're free!" There's no way to describe what happened next. Crying, tears, hugs, and Poland is not yet lost. Prisoners of other nationalities began to sing their national anthems too. The survivors were in desperate condition. Most were severely emaciated, suffering from diseases including typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery. Many were too weak to stand. Some were so traumatized they could barely speak. The Americans found children among the survivors as well. Statistics from Mauthausen showed that by late March 1945, the number of juvenile prisoners had increased to 15,048, representing 19.1% of the camp's 78,547 inmates at that time. One particularly striking image captured by American photographers shows a 13-year-old orphan, a survivor of the camp. There were also women among the survivors. Although Mauthausen had been primarily a camp for men, a women's section had been opened in September 1944, with the first transport of female prisoners arriving from Auschwitz. Eventually, more women and children had come to Mauthausen from Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, Gross-Rosen, and Buchenwald, as the Nazis consolidated their camp system in the face of Allied advances. Among the women was Eva Clark, who had been born in the camp just 3 weeks before liberation. Her survival, and that of her mother, was nothing short of miraculous in a place designed for death. For survivors like Alec Ward, who had endured slave labor and a death march to reach Mauthausen, the arrival of the Americans meant the difference between life and death. The first item of food which I received after the liberation was a tin of peas from an American soldier from his tank, Ward recalled. I drank the liquid first and was going to leave the peas for later. The liquid turned out to be too rich for my shrunken stomach, and I became ill from it. I gave the peas to a friend. This experience was common. After months or years of starvation, survivors' digestive systems could not handle normal food. The Americans quickly learned they needed to provide small, frequent meals of simple, easily digestible nutrients. Colonel Seibel organized the survivors into groups based on nationality, appointing leaders from among the prisoners to help maintain order and distribute aid. Special attention was given to the most critically ill, though for many, liberation had come too late. Hundreds would die in the days and weeks following liberation, despite the best efforts of American medical personnel. For those who survived, the moment of liberation was one of overwhelming emotion, relief, disbelief, joy mixed with grief for those who had not lived to see this day. Along with the 11th Armored Division, a war crimes investigating team arrived at Mauthausen in the days after liberation. Their task was to document the crimes committed there, evidence that would later be used in war crimes trials. The team discovered that the prisoners, at great personal risk, had managed to save key SS documents from destruction. The camp's records had been slated for burning by the fleeing SS, but members of the resistance within the camp had hidden them away. These documents revealed the systematic nature of the killing at Mauthausen. The records showed that the camp's gas chamber had remained operative until the very last days of the war. The SS had murdered nearly 3,000 prisoners from the infirmary after a selection on April 20, 1945. The last mass murder in the gas chamber took place on April 28, 1945, just a week before liberation, when 33 Upper Austrian Social Democratic and Communist opponents of the Nazi regime were killed. The Americans also discovered that in the face of the advancing Allied troops, the SS had begun destroying evidence of their crimes in April 1945. They had dismantled some installations for mass killing, ordered incriminating documents to be burned, and murdered concentration camp prisoners who, due to having witnessed systematic mass murder firsthand, would have been able to testify against the perpetrators. Physical evidence was abundant. The Americans found the gas chamber intact, a room disguised as a shower, with gas input apparatus still in place. They documented the crematorium, where bodies had been burned to dispose of the evidence of mass murder. They found execution sites where prisoners had been shot, hung, or killed by other means. Lieutenant Jack Taylor, the American OSS officer who had been a prisoner at Mauthausen, became a key witness. When asked by reporters what he experienced, Taylor related the starvation, physical abuse, and killing perpetrated by the guards. Historical accounts note. Fortunately, my turn hadn't come, he said. Photos taken in May 1945 show Taylor explaining the operation of the gas chamber to American officials. The investigators also interviewed survivors from various countries, collecting testimonies about the brutality they had witnessed and endured. These accounts painted a picture of systematic dehumanization and murder. Spanish prisoner Francesc Boix, a photographer who had managed to preserve hundreds of negatives documenting life and death in the camp, provided crucial evidence. His photographs captured SS officers in the camp, scenes of prisoner abuse, and the results of the Nazis' criminal medical experiments. Boix would later testify at the Nuremberg trials, his photographs providing incontrovertible evidence of Nazi atrocities. The Americans also interviewed local Austrians, many of whom claimed they had not known about the town's concentration camp. However, investigators found this difficult to believe, given the camp's visibility and the fact that many locals had worked as civilian employees there. They discovered that at least one local farmer had filed a complaint, not about the murders themselves, but asking the Nazis either to stop these inhuman deeds or do them where one does not see it. To ensure that the local population could no longer claim ignorance, American officers forced civilians from the town to tour the camp and witness the evidence of the crimes committed there. Some were also compelled to help bury the dead, digging graves for the hundreds of bodies that remained unburied when the Americans arrived. For the War Crimes Investigating Team, the evidence at Mauthausen was overwhelming. It would contribute to the prosecution of camp staff at the Mauthausen trial, part of the Dachau trials conducted by American military courts, as well as to the larger Nuremberg trials of major war criminals. For the young American soldiers who liberated Mauthausen, the experience left psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Most were in their early 20s, raised in small towns across America, and nothing in their training had prepared them for what they encountered. George Sherman was a 19-year-old tank gunner from Brooklyn when his patrol found Mauthausen. He was Jewish and had read about the Nazi camps in Europe in the Army's newspaper. Still, seeing a concentration camp with his own eyes was alarming. The piles of bodies struck him, he remembered in an oral history recorded in 2008. So did these people walking around like God knows, skeletons and whatnot. Frank Hartzell, who turned 100 in 2025, told researchers that his outrage at what he witnessed had stayed with him for 80 years. The American Liberators toured the gas chambers and the crematory ovens, photographing everything to ensure the evidence would be preserved. Major Franklin Lee Clark took photos of the dead stacked up in piles like cordwood, to the point that they had to bring in bulldozers and make mass graves. These images would later be used in war crimes trials, ensuring that the perpetrators would face justice. The soldiers of the 11th Armored Division also faced the challenge of caring for the survivors while continuing their military mission. The division was still at war. German forces had not yet surrendered everywhere, and they had to balance their humanitarian responsibilities with their military duties. Colonel Richard R. Seibel, who took command of Mauthausen after liberation, organized the massive relief effort. His men brought in 2 field hospitals, arranged for food and medical supplies, and began the process of identifying and documenting the survivors. The soldiers distributed whatever rations they had, K-rations, chocolate bars, cigarettes, before more supplies could be brought in. They gave away their own clothing to prisoners who had nothing but tattered striped uniforms or rags. For 35 days, Colonel Seibel remained at Mauthausen, overseeing the emergency response before being transferred to a post in the Austrian Alps. During this time, he witnessed both the worst of humanity in the evidence of Nazi atrocities and the best in the resilience of the survivors and the compassion of his men. The psychological impact on the Liberators was profound. For many, it transformed their understanding of the war they had been fighting. No longer was it simply about defeating an enemy army. They now understood they had been battling an ideology of hatred that had produced industrial-scale murder. Major George E. King, another Mauthausen liberator, would warn in a 1980 interview, "This is the lesson we have to learn. It could happen here." For King and his fellow soldiers, what they had witnessed was not just a historical event, but a warning about human nature and the fragility of civilization. The experience gave the American Liberators what one historian called a lifelong vaccine against extremism. They had seen firsthand the ultimate consequences of dehumanizing others, of allowing hatred to become state policy, of remaining silent in the face of escalating persecution. In a profound way, the liberation of Mauthausen created a bond between the liberators and the liberated, a shared witness to both the depths of human cruelty and the possibility of redemption through compassion and justice. As news of the liberation of Mauthausen spread, journalists arrived to document the scene. Their reports shocked a world that was still coming to terms with the full scope of Nazi atrocities. Photographs taken by army photographers were published in newspapers across the United States and around the world, bringing the reality of the Holocaust into people's living rooms. On May 7, 1945, just 2 days after the liberation of Mauthausen, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The war in Europe was officially over. Victory in Europe, VE Day, was proclaimed on May 8 and is observed to this day. For the survivors of Mauthausen, however, liberation was only the beginning of a long journey of recovery. Many remained in displaced persons camps for years, unable or unwilling to return to their home countries, which had either been destroyed by war or where they faced continued persecution. On May 16, 1945, a ceremony was held on the roll call area of Mauthausen to bid farewell to the Soviet prisoners, who would be repatriated to the USSR. At this ceremony, members of the International Prisoner Committee read out what became known as the Mauthausen Oath, in which they called for the establishment of a world of free men. While some groups of prisoners were able to return home thanks to convoys organized by state institutions, countless deportees remained behind. Either they were no longer welcome in their home countries, they had lost their families, or they hesitated given the unstable political situation in Eastern Europe, particularly as the Iron Curtain began to descend. Justice for the crimes committed at Mauthausen came in various forms. Franz Zierreis, the camp's commandant, was shot while trying to escape after the liberation, and subsequently died of his wounds. Before his death, he reportedly gave a confession, detailing some of the atrocities committed under his command. In the months and years following the war, Allied authorities conducted a series of trials of Mauthausen personnel. The main Mauthausen trial, part of the Dachau trials conducted by the U.S. military, took place from March 29 to May 13, 1946. 61 cases, involving over 300 defendants, pertained to Mauthausen and its subcamps. At the conclusion of the trial, 58 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, and 3 were sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentences were carried out at Landsberg prison in Bavaria, the same prison where Adolf Hitler had been incarcerated in 1924 and where he wrote Mein Kampf. Evidence from Mauthausen also featured in the trials of major war criminals at Nuremberg, illustrating the systematic nature of Nazi crimes. The testimony of survivors like Francesc Boas, the Spanish photographer who had preserved evidence of SS crimes, proved crucial in securing convictions. For the local population around Mauthausen, who had claimed ignorance of the camp's true nature despite living in its shadow for years, the aftermath brought uncomfortable revelations. Many had been complicit, either actively or through their silence. Some had benefited economically from the camp's existence, working as civilian employees or supplying goods and services. The liberators ensured that they could no longer look away. As one account notes, the American liberators made sure that the townspeople could no longer look away from the murderous rampage carried out in their backyards. In the immediate post-war period, the Soviet forces occupying that sector of Austria took over parts of the camp as barracks. Then, in an unusual move, the site was turned over to the Austrian government in 1947, specifically for the purpose of memorialization. Some buildings, such as the medical barracks, had been burned soon after liberation, but a core of structures remained. Mauthausen opened as a memorial site in 1949, becoming one of the earliest concentration camps to be preserved as a place of remembrance. Survivors played a major role in designing interpretation and memorialization. From 1970 to 2013, when a new permanent exhibition opened, the camp's main exhibition was one designed by a survivor. Today, the Mauthausen Memorial receives thousands of visitors annually, including many Austrian schoolchildren, ensuring that the lessons of this dark chapter of history are not forgotten. In the decades following liberation, survivors of Mauthausen carried forward the memory of what had happened there. Their testimonies, memoirs, and activism ensured that the world would not forget the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Simon Wiesenthal, perhaps the most famous Nazi hunter in history, was liberated from Mauthausen on May 5, 1945. Weighing just 99 pounds and barely able to walk, he had survived multiple camps and a death march. After recovering his health, Wiesenthal dedicated his life to tracking down Nazi war criminals, establishing the Jewish Historical Documentation Center in Linz, Austria. His work led to the capture and trial of numerous Holocaust perpetrators, including Adolf Eichmann, who was tried and executed in Israel in 1962. Survivors organized themselves into associations based on nationality or the camps they had been imprisoned in. The Comité International de Mauthausen, CIM, was established to represent former prisoners internationally and to advocate for the preservation of the camp as a memorial site. The first commemoration ceremony at Mauthausen was held in 1946, organized by survivors. Since then, annual liberation ceremonies have been held, growing to become one of the largest Holocaust commemorations in the world. Tens of thousands of people, including survivors, their families, and countless young people, participate each year. Survivors also shared their stories through memoirs, interviews, and artistic works. Christian Bernadac's book, The 186 Steps, provided a detailed account of the stairs of death. Mikis Theodorakis, the renowned Greek composer, created the Mauthausen Trilogy in 1965, a cycle of 4 arias with lyrics based on poems written by Iakovos Kambanelis, a Mauthausen survivor. For many survivors, the trauma of Mauthausen never fully healed. Physical ailments resulting from their imprisonment, lung diseases from working in the quarry dust, skeletal problems from beatings, digestive issues from years of starvation, plagued them for life. The psychological scars were often even deeper. Nightmares, anxiety, depression, survivor's guilt. Yet many found ways to rebuild their lives. They married, had children, pursued careers, and contributed to their communities. Their resilience in the face of unimaginable suffering became a testament to the human spirit's capacity for recovery and renewal. The children and grandchildren of Mauthausen survivors have also played a role in preserving memory. Many have become active in Holocaust education, sharing their families' stories with new generations. Some have undertaken pilgrimages to Mauthausen, seeking to understand the experiences that shaped their families. Hannah Berger Moran, Mark Olsky, and Eva Clark, all born in the camp system in the final days before liberation, refer to themselves as siblings by heart. Their survival as newborns in a place designed for death was nothing short of miraculous. All three have dedicated themselves to sharing their stories, representing what they call the final witnesses to the Holocaust. The Spanish survivors of Mauthausen maintained a particularly strong collective memory. Many had fought against fascism in Spain before being imprisoned by the Nazis, and they continued their anti-fascist activism after liberation. They were among the first to organize commemorations at the camp, and played a crucial role in preserving evidence of Nazi crimes. As the survivor generation has aged and passed away, the responsibility for remembering has shifted to subsequent generations. Museums, educational programs, and memorial sites like Mauthausen have taken on increased importance in ensuring that the lessons of the Holocaust are not forgotten. The survivors' ultimate legacy lies in their insistence that remembering the past is essential for building a better future. As expressed in the Mauthausen Oath, their hope was that the suffering they endured would lead to a world of free men, where such atrocities could never happen again. When American soldiers entered Mauthausen on May 5, 1945, they encountered a system designed not just to imprison people, but to destroy them, methodically, through starvation, exhaustion, disease, and deliberate cruelty. From the survivors, they learned about the horrific daily routine that had been imposed on prisoners. Each day began before dawn with the dreaded wake-up call at 4:30 a.m. Prisoners were given mere minutes to dress, make their bunks with military precision, and use the inadequate toilet facilities. Those who moved too slowly were beaten or killed as examples to others. Roll call on the Appellplatz, roll call square, followed, regardless of weather conditions. In the bitter Austrian winter, with temperatures well below freezing and snow often knee-deep, prisoners stood for hours while guards conducted their counts. Those too weak to stand were often shot on the spot or selected for the infirmary, which was essentially an antechamber to the gas chamber. In summer, the exposed square offered no shelter from the baking sun. After roll call came the assignment to work details. The dreaded quarry detail was considered a death sentence. Other work assignments included construction projects within the camp, labor in the armaments factories, or service in the camp infrastructure, laundry, kitchen, or barracks maintenance. Certain skilled prisoners worked as craftsmen, producing goods for the SS or for German civilians. Food rations were deliberately inadequate, designed to weaken and eventually kill the prisoners through starvation. Breakfast consisted of a thin, bitter liquid the SS mockingly called coffee, made from roasted grain or acorns, with no nutritional value. Lunch, eaten at the worksite, was typically a watery soup containing a few potato peels or turnip pieces. Dinner might be 300 grams of bread, often stretching dough with sawdust, and a small piece of margarine or sausage if the prisoners were lucky. This starvation diet provided only 700 to 1,200 calories per day, far below the 2,000 to 2,500 calories needed for basic survival, let alone for prisoners performing hard physical labor. The result was extreme emaciation. Survivors described the phenomenon of Mauthausen, the term used in the camps for prisoners who had reached such a state of physical and psychological deterioration that they appeared like walking corpses, barely able to move, their humanity almost entirely stripped away. Disease ran rampant due to the overcrowded conditions and lack of sanitation. Typhus, spread by lice, was particularly feared. Dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and various infections claimed countless lives. The camp infirmary, rather than providing healing, was often where prisoners were sent to die, or to be selected for the gas chamber if they were deemed no longer useful for work. Prisoners developed various strategies to survive. Solidarity networks formed among national groups or political affiliates, with those able to secure slightly better positions sharing resources with others. The Spanish Republicans, Polish intelligentsia, and communist prisoners were particularly well organized, creating mutual aid systems that saved many lives. Some prisoners managed to obtain positions in the camp administration, working as clerks, translators, or capos, prisoner functionaries. While these roles provided some protection, they also placed prisoners in the impossible position of participating in the system that oppressed them, often forcing them to make life-or-death decisions about fellow inmates. The SS guards engaged in systematic terror and arbitrary violence. Random beatings, humiliations, and killings were daily occurrences. Some guards were notorious for their sadism, turning torture and murder into a form of entertainment. SS men would force prisoners to fight each other, to perform physically impossible tasks, or to stand in stress positions for hours, shooting those who faltered. Cultural and religious life continued clandestinely despite the brutal conditions. Prisoners organized secret concerts, poetry readings, and religious services. Education took place in whispered conversations. These activities represented not just resistance, but an assertion of humanity in a place designed to destroy it. When the Americans liberated Mauthausen, they found a population of survivors who had endured this regime of terror for months or years. That anyone survived such conditions seemed miraculous to the soldiers who entered the camp that day in May 1945. When the War Crimes Investigating Team arrived at Mauthausen following its liberation, they found abundant physical evidence of the camp's deadly purpose. Much of this evidence remains preserved at the memorial site today, a stark reminder of Nazi atrocities. The camp's stone walls still stand, enclosing an area of approximately 20 hectares, 49 acres. The main entrance, through which the American Liberators passed, remains largely unchanged, a grim portal topped by a guard tower. Inside, the roll call square, where prisoners were forced to stand for hours regardless of weather conditions, is preserved as an open space for reflection. The barracks where prisoners were crowded in inhumane conditions have been partially reconstructed. Some original buildings remain, while others are represented by their foundations, giving visitors a sense of the camp's scale and layout. The gas chamber, disguised as a shower room, remains intact, a small, unassuming space that conceals its deadly purpose. Pipes that delivered Zyklon B gas can still be seen. Adjacent is the crematorium, where bodies were incinerated to hide the evidence of mass murder. The ovens stand as silent witnesses to industrialized killing. The quarry below the camp continues to exist, though nature has reclaimed much of it. Trees and bushes now grow where prisoners once labored and died. The infamous stairs of death have been modified for safety, but still connect the quarry to the camp above, allowing visitors to comprehend the brutal journey prisoners were forced to make multiple times daily. Among the most powerful pieces of physical evidence recovered at liberation were personal possessions of the prisoners. Watches, eyeglasses, shoes, and other items taken from the inmates were discovered in the camp commandant's office and other locations. Some of these items are now displayed at the Memorial Museum, humanizing the immense statistics of death. The camp's records, saved from destruction by prisoners at great personal risk, provided crucial documentary evidence of the systematic nature of the killing. These records included death certificates, transfer documents, and other administrative papers that revealed the bureaucratic machinery behind the Holocaust. Photographs taken by the SS themselves became evidence of their crimes. Camp guards had documented various aspects of life and death at Mauthausen, apparently without concern that these images might one day be used against them. Additional photos taken secretly by prisoners like Francesc Boix provided even more damning evidence. In addition, the Allied forces extensively photographed and filmed the camp at liberation. Signal Corps photographer J. Malin Heslop captured images of emaciated survivors in the Ebensee subcamp, sucking on sugar cubes provided by U.S. soldiers. Army film crews documented the conditions in both Mauthausen and the nearby Gusen camp, creating footage that would be shown around the world and used in war crimes trials. Physical evidence also included medical specimens collected by Nazi doctors conducting pseudoscientific experiments on prisoners. Human remains were found preserved in jars or prepared as anatomical displays, a grisly testament to the dehumanization of the camp's victims. The Americans collected and cataloged all this evidence, creating a comprehensive record of Nazi crimes at Mauthausen. This documentation proved invaluable for the prosecution of war criminals and for educating future generations about the Holocaust. Arthur Corder, who was present at the liberation, acquired material from Mauthausen that he was authorized to take back to the United States. His collection included watches found in the camp commandant's desk, an Agfa Billy Clack camera he used to document the liberation, and photographs from the camp. He also collected a certificate of listed captured military equipment dated May 9, 1945, which certified his permission to mail seized objects, including a knife, German Bible, German coins, Nazi flag, and Nazi armband. Today, this physical evidence is preserved at various institutions, including the Mauthausen Memorial, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and other archives and museums worldwide. It serves as incontrovertible proof of the atrocities committed and a warning to future generations. 75 years after the liberation of Mauthausen, Frank Hartzell sat in his home, surrounded by family, celebrating his 100th birthday. One of the last surviving liberators, he still remembered clearly what he had witnessed on May 5, 1945. "What I saw and experienced appalled me," he told a researcher in 2025. The outrage has stayed with him for 80 years. The Mauthausen concentration camp complex, once a site of unimaginable suffering, stands today as a memorial and museum. The main camp was designated as a public memorial by the Austrian government in 1949 and receives thousands of visitors annually. The site preserves the memory of the more than 190,000 people who were imprisoned there between 1938 and 1945, and the at least 90,000 who were murdered. For the survivors, the journey after liberation was long and often difficult. Many spent years in displaced persons camps before finding new homes. Some returned to countries where they faced continued discrimination or found their communities and families had been destroyed. Others emigrated to Israel, the United States, or other nations to build new lives. The last mass commemorative gathering of Mauthausen survivors took place in 2015, marking the 70th anniversary of liberation. As the survivor generation has passed away, the responsibility for remembering has shifted to their children and grandchildren, and to society as a whole. The Mauthausen Oath, spoken by liberated prisoners in May 1945, continues to resonate. The gates are open. We are free. We bow our heads in reverence before all those who had to die here for the cause of human freedom. We will take up the common struggle against imperialism and nationalist hatred. This is our debt to the millions of people murdered here. The world must never forget what happened here. The town of Mauthausen itself has had to reckon with its proximity to these crimes. For decades after the war, many locals maintained their claim of ignorance, despite the camp's visibility and the employment it provided. Gradually, newer generations have confronted this history more honestly, acknowledging the complicity of silence. The quarry, where so many died, continues to exist, though now overgrown with trees and bushes. The infamous stairs of death are currently closed to visitors because they are deemed unsafe by Austrian health and safety regulations, a striking contrast to the conditions prisoners were forced to endure. Many survivors have insisted that the stairs should be reopened to preserve the memory of suffering there. The liberation of Mauthausen by the 11th Armored Division on May 5, 1945, came at the very end of World War II in Europe. It was one of the last major concentration camps to be freed by Allied forces. For those who survived, May 5th became a second birthday, a day when life began anew. Yet the legacy of Mauthausen extends beyond the individual stories of suffering and survival. It stands as a warning about the consequences of hatred, the dangers of dehumanizing others, and the terrible possibilities that exist within human nature. It also bears witness to the courage of those who resisted, the resilience of those who survived, and the compassion of those who liberated. As the direct witnesses to these events have passed from the scene, the physical site of Mauthausen and the documented history of what happened there become increasingly important. They remind us that the Holocaust was not an abstraction, but a reality experienced by millions of individuals, each with a name, a face, a story. In the words of Mauthausen liberator Major George E. King, spoken in 1980 but echoing through the decades, this is the lesson we have to learn. it could happen here. The liberation of Mauthausen was not just the end of a terrible chapter in human history. It was also a beginning of remembrance, of witness, of the ongoing work to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. Thank you for listening. If you are also proud of the bravery of our soldiers, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical stories.